3, 2, 1.
Hello, and welcome to this first webinar presented by CCS Europe, Carbon Capture and Storage Europe, which is an advocacy group that recognises that this technology is going to be needed in order for Europe, for the world, to reach net zero emissions. Now, I'm Chris Davies. I'm the director of CCS Europe, a former CCS rapporteur in the European Parliament. And with me, three guests, all of whom are supporters of CCS, but don't assume that this is simply going to be completely one-sided. I'm going to be playing devil's advocate and asking all the difficult questions that have ever been asked of me. So I hope you'll find this challenging and interesting. Our theme, CCS, love it or hate it, lots of different views, lots of different opinions. So let me introduce our guests. First of all, Stuart Haszeldine, the world's, I think, only professor of CCS, Edinburgh University, suffering at this moment from COVID, so I expect him to cough many times during the course of this broadcast, so we excuse you, Stuart. Lina Nagell, Senior Manager at Bellona Europe here in Brussels, and Rodolphe Nicolle, Secretary General of the European Lime Association. So here we have a pleasant chat between people who know a lot about this subject for the next 45 minutes. Lina, let me start to you. I am going to be provocative, but I'm going to throw you an easy one. Bellona, your organisation, an environmental NGO based originally in Norway, you've been supporting CCS, the need for that deployment of the technology for longer than anyone, for 30 years. So why does Bellona support CCS? Why did it come out so early to say it was needed?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think that what's important to recognize is, of course, that Bellona as an organization has always been founded very much in science. And we do see that the science is very clear. We do need CCS as part of the puzzle to reach net zero. And I think that's what's important to acknowledge there as well, is that, of course, we're not looking at CCS as the one solution to solve all of this. It's not a silver bullet. It is one part of the puzzle that we need to get in place to reach net zero. And we cannot reach net zero without it, in particular when we look at process emissions in industry, which strictly cannot be decarbonized in any other way. And one thing that we always try to say when we're talking about our support of CCS is that, you know, there's nothing in our mandate that says that we necessarily want to work on CCS. It's just that we don't see any other way to address these emissions than CCS. And for anyone who disagrees with us, we of course have an open door policy and we ask, okay, but what is the alternative? Because that is simply what we cannot see.
Well, interestingly, you say that, but the majority, it's in the past, the majority of environmental NGOs have been critical of CCS. And they say it's a means simply of supporting the fossil fuel industry. It's a means of sucking money from governments, public money that could be spent on developing renewables or alternatives, could be better spent in other ways. I mean, you must face, well, what do you do when you're in a forum of environmentalists defending CCS?
Well, luckily, we're also environmentalists. So we tend to, again, try to have as good of a conversation about where we disagree. And I think that's the most important thing, to really, when we look at where we disagree, I think most of the time it's based on a misunderstanding of how CCS should be used and what the role of CCS should be in the green and just transition. Because I think that a lot of people do misunderstand and believe that that Bellona, for example, is trying to heighten CCS as the one solution to fix everything. And that's not the case. I think one of the arguments I hear the most is that, all right, we might need CCS, but we need to try everything else before we get there. And from our perspective, we simply don't have that time. And I think that's something that environmentalists are very quick to point out. We don't have the time. We need to act now. And the same is the issue with CCS. And then I think there is a lot of fear that it's going to be lost investments because there will be investments into CCS as opposed to renewables. But what we have to understand is that CCS, particularly on industry, it's in no way trying to keep up business as usual. It is, in fact, a change for the long term and trying to shift and decarbonize.
Okay, you mentioned process emissions. Rodolphe, you're representing the lime industry. why does the lime industry need CCS?
Yeah, obviously, and thank you for the question, Chris. We are very well aligned with what has been said by Lina previously. The lime sector, specifically in Europe, produce around 20 million of ton on a yearly basis. And when you're producing 1 ton of lime, you're producing roughly 1 ton of CO2 as well. We are among the very hardest, hard to abate sectors. And the reason is what has just been said, mainly because we have more than 70% of unavoidable process emissions. So it's not related to the fuel combustion or the energy efficiency of your kilns, but to the decarbonation effect of the limestone to become lime at the end of the day. So as it has been said again, it's not seen as a silver bullet because many efforts are already launched and engaged by EULA members, but it's a very important part of what could be our decarbonization pathway, obviously. And this also related to the maturity of the technologies, I would say. Now it's happening. We see the investment here and there launched, and we are very happy to welcome this new opportunity for the sector.
Okay, and what's lime used for? I think if it's spread on fields, but...
Yeah, it's a very good question because, I mean, it's to my point of view, it's a miraculous product that absolutely nobody is aware of. It's a commodity of about 6,000 years of life, and it's used in more than 200 applications, from drinkable water treatment, flue gas treatment, but also construction materials, soil stabilization, and many other things. So in a nutshell, you can't make any steel, glass, cement, and a vast majority of papers without lime.
Okay, so you're saying the CO2 is released in the production of lime as a result of the chemical process.
Yes.
But I mean, the environmental. What I hear from many environmental NGOs, I mean, Lina's tried to address this. Is the fact is we need just to be spending more money on renewables. Renewables, one way or another, because they can provide hydrogen and the like, are the answer to most of our problems.
Well, it's very important for us to have access to renewables, to decarbonize the electricity and so on, obviously, but it represents only 25 to 30% of our CO2 emissions. All the rest are related to the process itself. So, and the only option for us is definitely the carbon capture. So many of the EULA members recently have been granted with the Innovation Fund for different projects in France, in Germany, and a few other places. And we see this happening. But yes, we are not to abate, as it has been so called, and there is a clear definition about it. And we need, obviously, CCS to get on our decarbonization pathway.
Okay, so how much CO2 is the lime industry currently capturing?
Currently capturing? Well, it's difficult because most of the projects are already engaged more on the CCU way because they were more, I would say, easy to implement in a certain way, less costly as well. We have at least 3 or 4 big projects related to kiln, the equipment of new kilns and the capacity of those carbon capture. So I don't have the clear figures of the potential of those 3 or 4 projects because they have just been granted recently. But yes, we're going to need roughly 15 million of capacity of carbon capture by 2050 if we want to become climate neutral.
Okay, to be honest, that's more than I expected. I mean, it's more the amount of work that's already taking place is more developed than I had anticipated. I thought this was all sometime that was needed in the future, but there wasn't actually any work taking place now. But there is.
There is actually, and big ones actually. In Germany and France, those are not anymore pilot projects, but ongoing projects which should deliver before 2030. But for the moment, they are at the first phase of development, so we can't say exactly what's going to be the performance, but we have great expectation for that. Okay,
turning to Stuart. Stuart, remind me, when did you become a professor of CCS?
Oh, that'll be in ancient prehistory, sometime around 2006, I think. And partly because we'd spotted the opportunity for CCS in the UK around 2002, and then as chance would have it, our local electricity supply company had a really big coal-fueled power station which they were interested to see if CCS could be fitted, and that all came together in extra support.
Yeah, but here we are 20 years later, and the amount... The number of full chain, well, there aren't any outside Norway, the amount of full chain CCS projects. I mean, did you expect it to take so long?
No, I thought we'd have it fixed in about 2 years because it's relatively easy, geologically speaking, to both to capture the CO2. Processes are known in refineries since the 1920s and 1940s, so carbon capture and removal has been well known. And the geological aspects, if you take the information bases and the data from literally many decades of oil and gas production, what you're trying to do is you reuse that same geology in a different way. And there's also experience since the 1970s in the United States of transporting carbon dioxide in pipes and injecting carbon dioxide deep below ground, albeit for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery, which is an entirely different purpose, but it shows that the engineering can definitely be done. And also remember there's a same project at Quest in Alberta, which is working below budget in a faster time than anticipated.
Well, you say it's relatively easy. Let me just ask a very basic question. Where does the CO2 get put? Because I imagine sort of enormous bat caves and things in which you can fill them like an underground reservoir.
Yeah, so bat caves are for Hollywood franchises, of which we don't have any on this. And so where this carbon dioxide goes to is in the tiny pore spaces between sand grains of rock. So anybody who's living in a town or a place where there are stone buildings, then if you have a look at those, either limestone or sandstone, you'll find that they're actually porous. They can soak up rainwater, for example. And that rainwater is going into the pore space, which can be 20% of the whole volume of the rock. So there's solid rock, which we're interested in here. Solid rock is not very solid. It's 20% space, which is where you can inject the carbon dioxide as a liquid, and that pushes the previous salty water out of the way, takes up the space, and what you then need is a seal, an impermeable layer of rock on the top to stop the carbon dioxide from floating up. But that combination of porous rock and a seal is exactly what we're looking for all the time and have looked for gas fields or for oil fields. So it's really quite a common occurrence worldwide.
It must take an enormous amount of energy or pressure to push this. Is it a gas or a liquid? I mean, how does this? It must take a lot of pressure anyway to push it into the rock.
Yeah. Okay. So CO2, in our normal experience of it, which is surrounding us now, it's a transparent gas, and it doesn't explode and it doesn't burn. And we also know that CO2 dissolves in water, because we can go and buy fizzy sparkling water in supermarkets and drink that, so that's proven. And we also know that when CO2 is compressed, it turns into a liquid. So if it's compressed to 70 atmospheres, so deeper than 700 meters down, then that's the carbon dioxide which is in fire extinguishers, for example. So again, that can be compressed and stored perfectly safely in our daily environment. So when we store CO2, then the energy goes into firstly the separation process. That chemical separation process usually uses a solvent, and that solvent has to be heated to drive off the carbon dioxide. So that is an energy penalty of doing carbon capture and storage. And then the second energy penalty is about between 2 and 5% of the total energy, which is the compression of the carbon dioxide to turn it from a gas into a liquid. And it's that liquid which is transported offshore, in our case through pipes, for the Norwegian cases at Snøhvit or Sleipner, or for the case in Quest in Alberta. And that carbon dioxide in a pipe can move for 10 kilometers or 300 kilometers. And it's then injected underground into that tiny pore space that I talked about earlier on.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back because I mean some of the issues you raised obviously affect the cost of this technology. Let me come back to Lina. Going back again to the opposition of environmentalists, is that changing? I mean, is there a change now, or is it just because? There's still a lot of skepticism about the oil and gas companies who, on the one hand, say, we can store CO2 and we should be doing it, but don't actually seem to be very proactive when it comes to making it all happen.
Well, yes, indeed. I think that I think there are things changing on all sides, because I think that currently, of course, we've seen that a lot of oil and gas companies have talked a big game of wanting to invest in CCS. haven't necessarily done so. So I think this is now the time is coming to see to what extent they're actually gonna fulfill these promises and actually decarbonize as well. But I think that when it comes to the environmental movement, I think that what is very helpful is also that it is being decoupled a bit from oil and gas. We are now seeing much more information as well coming out, a lot more webinars like this actually, that is informing people of what CCS is, and not in a general sense, but actually showing very clearly what a potential strategy of using CCS to reach net zero can be. And we do notice that a lot of other NGOs and environmentalists are more interested in talking about the issue, but we also do see that there is a tendency to try to make sure, of course, that the climate impact of CCS, especially when compared to counterfactual scenarios where other options are used, if there is possible to decarbonize through renewables, for example, is shown. And I think we can see that, for example, in the most recent suggestions, also in the ENVI Committee on the Net Zero Industry Act, where you have these kind of wordings of unavoidable emissions. Now, for Bellona in and of itself, we agree that, of course, we should try to decarbonize by any other mean than CCS, but we do think that unavoidable places too much of a strain at times, because there are sectors that can technically decarbonize by other means, but it's just not economically feasible at this moment. So I think that there's a movement, but I think that more information and conversations is needed, I think, on all ends of the conversation.
And the oil and gas companies, do you think, I mean, they, as I say, there is cynicism about them. It's said that they're trying to perpetuate the use of fossil fuels. Although, of course, if you take a fossil fuel power station and you apply CCS, then the cost of making electricity from that fossil fuel power station is going to increase hugely. So it's to their disadvantage, presumably.
Yeah, I think that there's, especially now when there's a lot of public subsidies, there are, of course, a lot of different actors who would like to get a hold of those subsidies to be able to continue their economic activities for as long as possible, because it does result in a lock-in effect. From our perspective, when we're talking about CCS, as I said, we're focusing on CCS where there really are no other options. So, of course, when it comes to power, we do have the option of renewables. So we don't necessarily see the reason of tying CCS to that conversation. That being said, of course, if there are specific instances where this perhaps makes sense due to flexibility issues, then of course we're always open to talk. But I think that this is exactly what has been the issue with CCS, the fact that it's been tied up into that conversation of trying to clean up a lot of kind of power production, for example, related to coal, as opposed to actually making a switch to renewables, which is in that case the long-term solution that we actually need. So I think that if I can just finalize a bit there on also oil and gas companies, I do think that the fact that there is so much skepticism and lack of trust also between oil and gas companies and the public, of course, them also talking a lot about CCS, but not really necessarily building it out, at least so far, it is not really helping. And I think the most recent case of this is, of course, that there is an obligation on the table here through the Net Zero Industry Act in trying to ensure that oil and gas producers in Europe actually develop storage for CO2, in particular for industrial emissions. And so far, we're actually seeing quite a lot of resistance from oil and gas producers towards this in some countries. But we are happy to have seen that IOGP actually signed a letter saying that this obligation is the right way to go. So I think that these are the small steps that one can do to try to kind of bridge that trust gap that is currently still there.
Okay, I'm going to come back onto the Net Zero Industry Act, which is currently before lawmakers here in Brussels. Rodolphe, we touched upon here about the cost of CCS. I mean, your members say, on the one hand, they say, we're going to need CCS in order to reach net zero or a dramatic reduction in our emissions. And yet they must be looking at the cost of a capture plant and all the work associated with it and thinking, I mean, how is that going to affect the industry, having to pay that sort of cost?
Well, definitely hugely. That's certainty. I mean, what worried me the most, I would say, is to having access to decarbonized electricity. That's definitely a priority, obviously, because all those new CCS technologies, and the one that you mentioned with Stuart, will represent roughly between 9 to 11 times our current electricity consumption. That means we're gonna need definitely.
So is that the lime industry or globally or
lime industry? If we look at the electricity consumption of the implementation of those projects, you need definitely more electricity than what we are consuming for the moment. And the first
not anymore. I mean, did you say 11 or 12? I mean, a huge amount more.
Yes, between 7 to 11 times what we are currently consuming. So this is why, I mean, this is also very important to pay attention to that. And it has been clearly said. We have developed a roadmap, which, by the way, we're going to be uploadable next week on our website. It's a very critical point to our views. We need also those energies, source of energies, just to be sure that we can implement those new technologies. But perhaps one point on what has been said regarding unavoidable emissions and unavoidable process emission and so on, that was also not only a wording, or it's perhaps seen as a wording discussion, and but it's really to insist on the fact that those unavoidable process emissions are really something that we can't avoid, obviously, as described, compared to those where we can make extra efforts and apply also different kind of technologies to avoid those emissions. So this is why we are called an hard to abate sector, and this is why we have used for a long time this terminology of unavoidable process emissions. But it's not to say that we are not trying to do our best on the side that we can try to reduce and obviously avoid those other emissions. But the one that we are referring to, are representing 70% of what we are emitting right now. So this is why it's huge for us. So, and another issue, perhaps very important as an enabler, it's also the transportation of CO2. Obviously, what kind of infrastructure around us, because for the lime producers, we have some quarries and facilities disseminated a bit everywhere in Europe, and having access to those infrastructures is also very critical.
Okay, so you're just flagging up. There were a whole series of obstacles that have to be overcome, but the biggest one, of course, must be cost. What do you need to secure the investment? What's needed to motivate it? Is there a business case emerging, if not there at the present time?
With what is extremely interesting for the moment, that we see the maturity of different technologies and even new technology popping up here and there, and specifically regarding the transport and injection and so on. So there are very long discussions about new development of standards for the transport, for the injection and so on, that's going to have a deep impact on the final cost of such a project. So it's pretty hard to understand in which direction all the lime producers will go, what kind of choice they're going to make, because they're going to have, I would say, a large number of different technologies available very soon, within the next 5, 6, 7 years. So far, the cost associated to that will be obviously huge, but it depends on what kind of technologies we're going to implement and have access to.
Okay, come back, Stuart. Coming to you, the basic questions. I mean, the first question people often ask is CO2 storage safe? Well, you've already suggested that CO2 is compared to methane is used in all sorts. It has all sorts of uses with which we are very familiar. But tell me, people are concerned about the idea of CO2 being injected underground, especially when it's below their own homes, or if that comes into being. If it's 100 kilometers off in the North Sea, people are less bothered. But when it comes down to the cost issue, it must be very significantly more expensive, or is it not, to inject CO2 offshore than it is potentially onshore?
Okay, yeah, so the simple answer is yes, anything offshore is more expensive. And although
that, of course, is where the gas and oil has been exploited in the past.
Yeah, but it's a lot cheaper to produce oil, let's say, from a land-based facility. You can get oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia for about $4 a barrel, compared with $30 a barrel in the North Sea. So quite often a factor of 10 increase of price is what you're talking about. But of course, what the offshore offers is, the first thing is that nobody lives there, and so there's much less public objection. And we know that many projects, whether they're wind projects or whether they're energy storage projects or whether they're carbon capture projects, many projects which are trying to develop onshore have faced huge public resistance through one method or another. And so the primary merit of going offshore is there's no people live there. Second merit is we know the geology of the offshore extremely well from the oil and gas industry, so we can resolve the layers of rock to within a couple of meters very frequently.
Wow.
So exactly what we're doing. And thirdly, you can monitor where the carbon dioxide is extremely accurately offshore, much more accurately than you can monitor, let's say, the carbon stored in a forest. And you can monitor by using the existing oil and gas technology to seismically image, to bounce sound waves off the layer of carbon dioxide liquid. And you can...
Okay, but if you to take Rodolphe's point, yeah. I mean, he's got lime works or presumably lime production plants which are some distance from offshore storage at the very least. I mean, if the rock formation below his plants was suitable, it would presumably help to keep the costs down of this technology, which is, and we're only using this technology in order to try and curb emissions into the atmosphere. If his people could just inject straight into the ground beneath their factory.
Well, I'd be very keen to help Rodolphe do that. And because obviously that is much less cost. But with any commercial enterprise, you'd be advised to have a plan B. And so joining a hub where there's a pipeline intending to go offshore into the North Sea through one way or another is the sensible first move. And then working out how you can link in your cement or lime works or limestone quarry into a transport network is obviously the next thing to try and do. And that will be more difficult. And it's a fact of life that big limestone quarries tend to be distant from industrial conurbations and places where people...
Yeah.
But the other thing I want to just mention is that several studies have started to be made now on the price impact into the whole economy. And so if the price of lime increased by 50%, let's say, that has only a 1% or 2% impact on the increased price of the building, which is made out of that cement, because that's only one of the many costs which go into the construction. So although we can finger or target individual items, then the economic cost is not great and the economic benefits for the future are essential.
Okay, thank you. Lina referred to the Net Zero Industry Act, which is currently being debated by policymakers. And the key proposal from the European Commission there is to place an obligation upon the oil and gas producers to make available storage capacity, CO2 storage capacity, capable of storing 50 million tons of CO2 annually by 2030. Now, 2030 is not many years off, and the oil and gas industry often comes and says, we can't do that. It takes us 7 years to develop a storage site. What do you think? Is the 50 million ton proposal within the EU alone? Is that realistic, Stuart?
Yeah, that has to be done. And so this goes to the question you were talking about of the price increase and of markets earlier on. So that one of the reasons that wind power has become so developed is that it turned out to be cheaper than the existing power, but also it was backed by government policies to make a market where you could sell that wind power into a market and get a good price, a guaranteed price for that. And so this first phase of public subsidy is really important. And this proposed mandate by the Commission for 50 million tonnes across the European member states, I think is pretty much exactly the right thing to do. And personally I would have made it 100 million tonnes, because that's what you need scientifically to be on the trajectory for net zero. But 50 million tonnes is a good start because it's the principle. And
technically it is feasible.
The Commission has done, using the databases which have been established through Horizon Europe projects, the Commission has looked at the available storage in all member states and does have a graph showing that this is possible, but it of course requires the oil companies to take an action. And we've also discussed that oil companies don't do this voluntarily because their job is to make maximum profit for their shareholders. But if it becomes an obligation, then they have to take the action, and that means we can unblock some of this lethargy with oil companies. And so I think that mandate is important, and I also think that ensuring a price for CO2 stored is important, because at the moment there you get a price for producing renewable electricity with low carbon, but you don't get a good price for storing CO2. You get a relaxation of the European Trading Scheme purchase of an emission certificate, and that's not enough to fund the CO2 storage. So we need to make the market in two ways.
Thank you. Lina, just looking around Europe or even the world, I mean, where are the leaders on CCS? Who is leading?
Well, I think, of course, we have to, if we're focusing now on Europe, we can see that Norway, of course, has a bit of a head start, you can say, but you also see the UK and also Denmark. And I just wanted to also touch on what Stuart is saying here in terms of how we would have liked the target for Europe to be even higher. I completely agree, of course, but I think we also need to remember that the 50 million ton target currently proposed is not supposed to include the EEA, so or Iceland, or of course the UK. So let's hope that we can get some matching targets there and maybe reach 100. But I think also, since you asked, Chris, of who is the leaders here, we have to also remember kind of Europe's role in the bigger scheme of things. And here, what is always brought up is the IRA, which we know has come into place in the US to try to incentivize carbon capture and storage as one of the technologies. That option in and of itself as support scheme in the shape and form that it takes is not an option for the EU. It could potentially be something that could be done through different member states, but of course those tools as tax adjustments are not feasible in the EU.
Okay, yeah, you mentioned Norway, of course, and Denmark very rapidly has come up the rankings and has just supported given as a first final investment decision for a full chain CCS project now in Denmark. And I think the Netherlands may well have another one before Christmas, we hope. But across the European Union, there seem to be an enormous number of member states that really haven't engaged with the subject at all. Any comment? I mean, what do we do about it? In most national capitals, there is no one waving a placard and saying we need CCS.
Yeah, and I think that's what we really need to focus on now, because this relates to, now we've kind of started to get some main actors that are kicking this off. And now we need to make sure that this is something that we look at holistically. We need to also look into this as a just transition mechanism. We need to look at all of Europe. This is not just about the emitters or the countries that are placed in Northern Western Europe. Those are actually not the countries where the greatest challenges when it comes to decarbonization of industry are also located. So I think that we are missing an opportunity if we don't look to Central and Eastern Europe, for example, Southern Europe, and that there is movement on the ground there as well. We do have a project there, for example, called Wise Europa, which is trying to connect a lot of these actors through CCS for CEE. And in general, I think especially now with public perception issues and the elections coming up, these areas will be the area where we really need to focus our attentions, because we have acceptance in Western and Northern Europe to a much higher degree than we will have in a lot of different countries. But if we want to be successful, we need support and understanding across Europe, and also projects and access to storage across Europe. And before I give word back just to link that also to Rodolphe's point on transport, why it's so crucial to ensure that we also have support mechanisms for not just available storage, but accessible storage, and kind of bridging the gap of the distance for different countries and different emitters from these storage sites.
Thank you. Rodolphe, I can't fault you for the way in which you champion CCS for the lime industry. But looking across the whole continent, if CCS is needed by a number of hard-to-abate sectors, like cement, like steel, possibly pulp and paper, some chemicals, waste-to-energy plants, and the like, I'm really surprised that the voice of many of these industries is remarkably quiet when it comes to speaking up and saying governments need to be drawing up strategies, working with us to put in place the support mechanisms. And indeed, clearly, many companies are going to make a lot of money by providing the equipment that's needed for this technology on a huge scale over the next few years. And they're remarkably quiet too when it comes to trying to push the commercial opportunities. Do you have any explanation for this? I mean, what's needed to wake up chief executives?
Well, you're right. I mean, they probably have to speak up because there is a business case, obviously growing, and we can notice that. And to illustrate perhaps what has been said by Stuart and pointed out as well by Lina, in the UK, for instance, the MPA Lime, which is the British Association, they have developed their own roadmap because they have access to a pipe on the Amberside point, which is a hub, an industrial hub, and they're going to be able to decarbonize by 2035 the full lime production in the UK. So what does it mean? That means that when all those enablers are there, you are able to reach a very interesting result. So that's already a good point. So more and more projects like this will be seen, understood, analyzed by the business community as well. And that's going to be also, I think, a good trigger for all of them to understand what they can do with. It's also true that I think Commissioner Vestager at the very beginning of the war in Ukraine said that a large community made a greedy choice with the Russian gas in a certain way. And since we saw that the different prices, carbon price and electricity and energy prices in general, have quite changed the perception, the view, but also the possibility to develop an interesting business model for CCS. So things are happening more and more. What I can see that the science made incredible progress. Business decisions have been already taken. Investments are launched now. We have to update as well the policy environment in a certain way, and to ensure that we can find some CCS champion among the different EU member states, because we were referring to Norway, to the UK, and a few others. We need some support within the EU. And I see Denmark, I see France as well, pushing very hard with the decarbonization plan, including a part of CCS with the development of different terminals in Dunkerque, in Le Havre, Saint-Nazaire, or Fos. So things are moving in the right direction. We can feel that there is a general momentum on all those aspects: science, standardization, finance, business decisions. We need to update now the policy level as well at the same time.
Okay, a lot to be done. Tell me, can we turn back to Stuart? I've got you here. Here you are, Professor of CCS, geologist. I do want to ask this question because it just gets me, the fact that there is this public concern about CO2 storage, especially onshore storage. And yet when Russia invaded Ukraine, we had to build up our methane gas reserves. It was celebrated, the fact that Europe was able to do this. What is the geological difference between methane storage and CO2 storage?
I think methane storage is harder.
Because methane, I am right here, methane is stored in rocks in Europe.
Yep.
There's a reservoir beneath Berlin, there's a reservoir beneath Paris.
Yep, exactly.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
So it's exactly the same principle as CO2 storage, in that you're injecting that methane gas into the tiny pore space between the sand grains. And it happens to be that some of these storage sites are beneath where a lot of people live. But I guess this is a sort of social science question, in that it seems to me that people accept what they're used to and they don't like a change. So if there's a change from methane to CO2, then they would probably object to that. If there was a change from CO2 to methane, they would probably object to that. And that's not a stupid statement particularly, because it means that we have to explain to people who are resident there, who are clear stakeholders, we have to explain to people why we believe and can in many ways demonstrate that CO2 storage can be secure for extremely long periods of time. And there are many...
So when you're a geologist, what do you mean by extremely long periods of time?
I mean by geological time, for millions of years and tens of millions of years.
Okay.
Whereas we're only wanting to store CO2 here for maybe 10,000 years and to remediate the climate. And so we can go to there are natural CO2 accumulations in France, in Germany, in Spain, and in the North Sea, and then of course in many states in the United States, which have been really well studied and shown to be secure and safe for long periods of time. So, but that's logic. And logic doesn't always convince people, so we have to speak to people emotionally and and win hearts and minds as well as the facts and numbers argument.
Okay, thank you very much. There we are. That's it just seems to me, I've come up with a little pat slogan, which is that we need to store methane to keep us warm in winter, and we need to store CO2 to stop us getting too hot in summer.
Keep us cool in summer.
Yeah, it's a bit pat. Okay.
Yeah, well, let me mention before you log off, Chris, that the uses of carbon capture and storage, we talked about mitigating power generation by burning coal and oil, and in a way that's where CCS started. But CCS can also have an application in hydrogen generation. If you want to split methane and make CO2 and then hydrogen, to use hydrogen as a fuel switch, then that needs CCS. We've talked a bit about industry, about steel industry, lime industry, paper industry. All that has CO2 storage applications. And of course, then there's also the removals industry, which has not yet started, about bioenergy, capturing the CO2 from bioenergy combustion, or capturing the CO2 from machines which suck carbon dioxide out of the air. And you can't do any of that list of topics unless you're able to store CO2. So it's not just power, is the point.
Okay, well, let me put one last question to you all, and it's not a fair question because you're not politicians, and it is very definitely a political question. And it's the simple question that any minister would ask when they go into a department and they're told by their civil servants, we are going to need a CCS strategy and we're going to need to promote this technology. And the minister is going to say, well, how do I pay for it? How do I subsidize it? How do I make it happen? So, okay, stay in the order. Lina, where does the government get the money from to support the first movers, at least in CCS development?
Well, I think there are several options, and I think that we have something that is part of the EU ETS. We have the Innovation Fund. We have the EU kind of own resources that we can use for this. We have the Connecting Europe facility, for example, under the 10E. Unfortunately, currently the European Union is not supporting transport through other means than pipelines under the 10T, but this is my blatant way of trying to highlight that should be the case. We also, in addition to, of course, having EU funding, we also need to have national funding that matches this. And then I would like to kind of end this by saying that I don't think it is beside the point of requiring also oil and gas companies to pay for this. I think if you look at the enormous profits that has been going into this industry, and also the historical responsibility here carried for emissions, I think that is fair. Also taking into consideration, of course, that there will be a business case here based on public funding for storing CO2. I think the money should also be coming from those.
Okay, thank you very much. Rodolphe, same question. Where does the minister get the money from to support the lime industry's adoption of CCS technology?
I think Lina made quite a good description of the current landscape and the different options available. Obviously, what I see, it's still very important to really earmark the funding that we can find from the ETS to Innovation Fund to those CCS projects, and more in particular the CCS infrastructure. And the point that she raised is also critical when you hear that the TNT is not allowing the CO2 transportation except by pipelines. It's really an issue for us, as I said, as we are very well disseminated on the European territory. That's something that we need to really pay attention. But I think by developing the business cases, explaining why there is something to do with and efficiently, that can help definitely to take the investment decisions.
Okay. Of course, also the ETS price, now it's, I think, 88 euros, and with free allowances coming to an end. I mean, your industry, presumably, if nothing is done, is going to have to pay a fortune in 10 years' time simply to emit the CO2.
Obviously, this is why the CCS is really critical for us, and the maturity of the different technologies, the availability of those technologies, the decarbonized electricity. I mean, we are in the pathway for many industrial players on those topics, and it's I wouldn't say it's now or never, but it's really now to take strong decisions to go in the right direction.
Thank you. And Stuart, all the conferences, all the discussions you've had over the past few decades, do you have a magic solution to where the money tree is?
Well, what was just talked about is really two different sorts of subsidy regime between Rodolphe and Lina. And I think that's fine for starting off, and that's what the UK is doing just now, and that's what the Innovation Fund's doing just now, etc. And those subsidies can show that the CCS chain works. But I also think you can't run an economy off a subsidy scheme. So even the IRA in the United States will have a finite life of a few years. And it's clear that mandates are coming down the track for carbon emitters to compulsorily store their CO2 in the United States. So I think we have to go to a mandate, because I'll accuse the oil companies, even in Europe, of doing the minimum they have to do to ward off the political pressure, and then certainly not leading. And the only way we can get them to lead is either to pay huge amounts of money to match the profits they make from oil and gas, which is really money down the drain, or we just make it a mandate and a condition of operation that they have to store the same amount of carbon every year that they bring in to the country. So if there's a mandate, then that will happen. And so I'm strongly in favour of that, and that's why I support the 50 million tonnes a year in Europe as a start on that.
That mandate, that financial mandate, you're looking at really on the European agenda yet. So it needs to.
On the UK agenda, though, we're having good conversations with the relevant minister for energy in the UK. That's not a win, but at least we're having a conversation about what an enduring regime would look like to take the funding away from the national treasury and put the obligation to fund back to the oil companies who produce the problem.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. And to those of you who've been watching and listening, thank you for participating in this first webinar discussion produced by CCS Europe. My guests today have been Stuart Haszeldine, Professor of CCS at Edinburgh University, Rodolphe Nicolle, the Secretary General of the European Lime Association, and Lina Strandvåg, Nagell, Senior Manager at Bellona Europe. Thank you all. That was great. Please keep a watch out for the next webinar, which will be in a month's time, where we'll be looking at what can be achieved technically by different CCS technologies and what's really happening across the world, who's emerging as the leaders. Thank you very much indeed.
Just to mention, there's 3 questions somebody might like to answer in the chat. Okay. Anyway, goodbye from me. Off to the next meeting.
Thanks. Thanks all. Bye.